In the early part of the 16th century, fear swept across Europe. Despite God's promise that he would never again wipe out the earth with the global flood, rumors spread that heavenly signs indicated God was preparing to go back on his word and that a universal flood would occur in February of 1524. According to contemporary sources, people postponed marriages, canceled contracts, abandoned fields, and failed to perform sacred ceremonies. Goods and low-lying properties were sold at a loss, as many literally fled for the hills. Some sources even claim that the Parliament of Toulouse began construction of an ark on a nearby mountain as insurance. Leonardo da Vinci did a series of sketches of terrifying floods, and even Martin Luther addressed the prognostication in a speech during Advent. Obviously, the flood never came. But the flood panic of 1524 is an interesting story of the first mass media panic, and of course, astronomy, before the telescope. The beginnings of the flood panic began in 1499. That year, Johannes Stoffler and Jacob Flom published an astronomical almanac. This sort of book was common and contained information on the positions of the planets as well as the timings of eclipses, conjunctions, and other interesting astronomical events. The 1499 edition covered the years of 1499 to 1531. By and large, these were purely mathematical predictions. But for 1524, the authors added an additional astrological prediction, stating, "In this year of 1524, we will see neither a solar nor a lunar eclipse, but most wondrous positions of the planets will occur. For in February there will be 20 small, mean, as well as great conjunctions, 16 of which will occupy a watery sign. These will signify indubitable change, variation, and alteration for almost the entire world, climes, kingdoms, provinces, estates, dignitaries, brutes, sea creatures, and crops, such as we have rarely heard of for many centuries from historiographers or from our own ancestors. Therefore, lift up your heads, you Christian men." This passage was rather benign, simply noting the coming conjunctions in February of that year and stating that it will cause a widespread change of an unspecified nature. For those not familiar, the sun, moon, and planets are all confined to a relatively narrow circle across the sky known as the ecliptic. They transverse this path, moving from west to east at different speeds, occasionally temporarily reversing direction, known as retrograde motion. Whenever one object passes another, it is known as a conjunction. However, the February 1524 conjunction was going to be special, because it wasn't just one, but a rapid series of them, as the sun, moon, and all 5 naked-eye planets would be in a narrow portion of the sky, causing a whole series of conjunctions, most of which would occur near the beginning of the zodiacal sign of Pisces. Although Stoffler and Flom's predictions were relatively vague, an anonymous pamphlet was released in 1512 which claimed that the unspecific changes and variations predicted by Stoffler and Flom would manifest as a massive flood. Historians have since identified its author as Luca Gaurico, an Italian astrologer who had previously suffered for his bold astrological predictions. In 1504, Giovanni Bentivoglio, an Italian nobleman who ruled as a tyrant over the city of Bologna, consulted Gaurico regarding his destiny. Gaurico provided a prediction that Bentivoglio disliked. In response, Bentivoglio had Gaurico tortured via the mancuerda. As with most medieval torture, it's rather gruesome, so I will leave it to interested viewers to research on their own. Regardless, the effects of the torture impacted Gaurico for the rest of his life, perhaps explaining his reluctance to sign his name to the prognostication of a flood, despite the fact that Bentivoglio had died a few years prior. Similar prognostications were also sent to the imperial diet at Trier, convened by Maximilian I that same year. These copies have not survived directly, but we know something of their content because Louis V, the Count Palestine of the Rhine, asked for responses from two other astrologers. The first of them was none other than Johann Stoffler, the author of the original almanac discussed previously. Unfortunately, his response is lost to us, but the second, from Johann Virdung of Hassfurt, quoted the author of the anonymous prognostications in his response. In it, we learn that the author, again believed to be Gaurico, predicted a flood of such magnitude that it would be almost impossible to find safe dwelling. He recommended that readers prepare a small cave in the mountains and take with you the equipment necessary for 30 days. Virdung was a professor of astrology at the University of Heidelberg and was well regarded for his astrological prognostications. Virdung accused Gaurico's text of being completely full of nonsense and fiction and not being founded in the astrological discipline. He accused Gaurico of not only attempting to frighten the lower classes, but King Maximilian and the Diet directly. But while Virdung condemned Gaurico, he could not dismiss the astrological implications of the conjunctions in a watery sign so easily. In his Practica Deutsch, published in 1521, he predicted a partial flood, like that in Achaia in the time of the patriarch Jacob, or Thessaly during the time of Moses. These floods people could avoid by fleeing to nearby hilltops, but Virdung does not predict that the flooding will be so large as to destroy an entire kingdom. Instead, Virdung tried to ameliorate the disaster by spreading its effects out over time, proposing that the effects would last nearly 40 years. Delayed effects of astronomical conjunctions was not a new concept to astrology. In the 15th and 16th centuries, astrology and theology held an uneasy truce. As we saw in my video on Christianity and astronomy, the Church was generally permissive of astrology unless it started impinging on free will. However, it was eager to accept astronomy which it felt supported the Christian narrative. To that end, the theologian and astrologer Pierre de Ailly searched for astronomical conjunctions that would have presaged the biblical flood. While he said that Noah certainly had the knowledge of the flood by divine revelation, it seems probable that some astronomical constellation could have pre-signified that effect and somehow could have been a partial cause of it. Christians had long attempted to construct a timeline of important events in Christian history. The most famous of them is the Ussher chronology derived from a literal reading of the Bible, although that one dates to 1650. However, many sources cite a chronology given in the Alphonsine table, and we can find a similar, or perhaps related, attempt in Peter Apian's Astronomicum Caesarium. In it, we are told that the flood of Noah occurred 3,101 years and 319 days prior to the birth of Christ, which is approximately the same period that de Ailly used. Initially, he cited Arab astronomers as a source for a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn 2 years before the flood as a possible cause. However, this was said to have occurred in Aries, which is not a watery sign, and would be difficult to see how it would indicate a flood. Meanwhile, other astrologers, notably John of Eschenden, attempted to calculate the dates of earlier conjunctions and eventually found one some 279 years prior to the supposed biblical flood in the sign of Cancer, which is a water sign. This enormous gap evidently didn't intimidate de Ailly in the slightest, and he adopted it in his Euclidarium, sweeping the gap under the rug and declaring, perhaps God wished this imprecision so that he might hide the secrets of the heavens from the unworthy. Regardless, this supposed conjunction became the recognized cause of the biblical flood. Thus, Virdung's proposition did not deviate from contemporaneous practices. Another of the first astronomers to respond to the flood prediction was Albertus Pighius of Camden. In 1518, he wrote against the herd of prognosticators who issue annual predictions and misname themselves astrologers. This text is divided into a few sections. The first is an attack on what he believes to be shortcomings in the field of astrology as being widely practiced at the time. He begins with an attack on another Dutch astronomer, Jasper Lejet. Although Lejet's prognostications no longer seem to exist, Pighius indicates that he had, in some way, tied it to the supposed conjunction 279 years prior to the biblical flood, indicating that Lejet may have been an early endorser of the flood hypothesis. Pighius states that, in Lejet's prognostications for 1519, Lejet abandoned the practice of basing his predictions on the entry of the sun into Aries, and instead relies overly much on conjunctions, specifically of Jupiter and Saturn. Pighius indicates that the focus on the conjunctions is an invention of Abu-Masar and other Arabic astronomers. In contrast, Pighius recommends staying true to the astrological texts of Ptolemy, the Centiloquium and the Tetrabiblos, referred to by its Latin name, the Quadripartium. As a quick note, the Centiloquium is no longer believed to be written by Ptolemy, as some of the propositions contained therein are decidedly from the Arabic tradition just mentioned. But those exceptions aside, these texts place their greatest emphasis on the sun and moon, and especially eclipses for astrological predictions. I should also note that while this might seem on the surface like Pighius is rejecting Arabic or pagan astrology, it's not. Indeed, he refers favorably to the astrology of Abraham ibn Ezra and Mashallah ibn Athri. Next, Pighius attacks the chronologies used by D'Ailly, specifically the Alphonsine tables. He takes as his source of truth the Old Testament itself, which only supports around 2,300 years between the biblical flood and the birth of Christ. He also attacks other astrologers for attempting to make too precise of predictions, such as predicting the weather to a specific day, or for a single city based on the date that the city was founded. He describes predictions on the success or failure of crops as sortilege, divination through sorcery. Yet, despite his misgivings, Pighius himself predicted that in the coming year, wine would be good and cheap, but that crops which require rain over sunshine would suffer. In the second part, Pighius professes to discuss the 1524 conjunction directly, but he largely does so by reiterating his previous points, that such a prognostication is impossible because a conjunction of planets is immaterial and they hold no true power. Rather, he claims that the overwhelming majority of the power is vested in the luminaries, the sun and moon. Although Pighius downplays the importance of planets in his astrological worldview, he doesn't deprive them of power entirely as some other astrologers, such as Pico della Mirandola, were wont to do. But even if one wanted to ascribe meaning to planetary conjunctions, Pighius suggested that their contrary properties should counteract one another. Pighius's work was dedicated to another astronomer, Agostino Nifo, who Pighius refers to as a chief of the philosophers of our age and a restorer of a truer astrology. This is largely because Nifo had also argued in favor of a Ptolemaic approach to astrology, although Nifo expressed some sympathy for those who favored the Arabic astrologers, as he recognized that Ptolemy's texts were quite difficult, in part due to poor translations. Perhaps spurred on by Pighius's dedication, Nifo also weighed in on the flood in a booklet published in 1520 entitled De Falsa Diluvi Prognosticatione. Despite the title of his work, the first section lays out the argument in favor of the flood. He misattributes the claims to the author of the Ephemerides, by which he means Stoeffler, despite the fact that, as we have seen, Stoeffler's predictions were nothing of the sort. He then goes on to aptly articulate the arguments that could be used in favor of a flood, doing so in a few parts. In the first, he presents the argument based on the conjunction of the planets. He states that, in this philosophy, there is a principle in which a greater effect must come from a greater causation. Thus, if there was to be a cataclysm of this sort, it could only come from a most powerful conjunction, particularly one which involves the greatest of the planets, Jupiter and Saturn. As with Pighius, Nifo recognizes that this type of astrology originates with Abu-Masar and states that Mashallah approved of it. Both affirm that conjunctions in the watery signs indicate rain. He also invokes the supposed conjunction some 287 years prior to the flood of Noah as evidence that the effects of conjunctions can be delayed. Second, Nifo makes an argument in favor of the flood using the Ptolemaic paradigm, noting that there would be a lunar eclipse on the night of August 25th of the preceding year, which would occur in the beginning of Pisces. He states, planetary conjunctions have powerful effects combined with eclipses. Indeed, no stronger effect has been discovered than those in watery signs on the account of eclipses. Lastly, Nifo gives a theological argument, stating that Noah's flood was caused in response to human wickedness. Nifo then gives an account of all the terrible things he perceives to be happening in the world. He closes out this section arguing for a flood, stating, "And so it shall be as never before, although no greater. These signs are very powerful, and the future flood will not be due to the power of the conjunction alone, but also by the power of human wickedness, which is so prevalent today. This argument terrifies me, draws me in, envelops me, and convinces me entirely." In the second section, Nifo immediately begins telling the reader how unconvinced he is, largely following and expanding on the same reasoning as Pighius. In opposition to the philosophy of conjunctions, he provides support for taking the sun and moon as the predominant astrological powers by noting how much more powerful these luminaries obviously are to our senses. He notes that when the sun rises, we can immediately feel its power as heat. Similarly, he claims that a night with a full moon feels warmer. In contrast, Saturn was believed to have a cold nature, but no one reports feeling cold because Saturn rose. Nor do we feel warmth from Mars, despite its hot nature. Furthermore, he explains that the nature of Mars is also dry and should counteract some, but not all, of the potential deluge. He then makes an argument based on Aristotle's meteorology. In this, he states that for there to be rain, water must have evaporated into the sky, and thus, for there to be enough rain to cause a global flood, it would have had to be preceded by a prolonged period of drought. As the supposed flood was to happen in February, it was unlikely that there would be a period of sufficient warmth immediately prior to cause such evaporation. Nifo also refutes the aforementioned theological argument by noting that God did indeed promise not to destroy the world through a flood again, and cites the rainbow God created to affirm this. He then has an interesting argument noting that the opposite sides of a rainbow are red and blue. We'll ignore the violet. Nifo argues that these colors are related to the conditions of the atmosphere, with red being related to dry air and the blue to humid air. Thus, if these are out of balance for an extended period, as he presumes they would be from the previous argument, then it would prevent rainbows from forming. And since rainbows were still being observed to occur, Nifo confidently rules out either a flood or a fiery apocalypse for the time being. At this point, we've begun finding several threads to trace in this story. Firstly, there is the simple battle of whether or not the predicted flood was true, and if so, to what extent. Second, we're seeing the beginnings of a battle over what the foundational principles of astrology should be. And soon, we'll see another discussion arise: the place of print media and its influence on commoners. Historians estimate that in the years leading up to the potential flood, over 160 different broadsheets, pamphlets, practicas, treatises, and books were written on the subject by around 60 different authors. Many were reprinted several times due to demand, and it is estimated that Europe was proverbially flooded with hundreds of thousands of pieces of printed media surrounding this topic. 1521 begins seeing the first publications pushing back on the efforts to denounce the flood. Among the authors is Alexander Seitz, a surgeon as opposed to an astrologer. Historians have described his work as unrestrained alarm. In it, he predicts that from the natural manner of the heavens, and as reasoned by my tract, shall bring for a long time lightning, thunder, and hail, and such cloud-breaking rain that will bring destruction upon mountains, valleys, and castles, and humanity will cry out in fear and suffer ruin that is more than horrible to hear. His broad application here seems to put him in Gaurico's camp, in the flood being widespread. It is also known that Seitz sold anonymous pamphlets on the topic at the Diet of Worms that same year. Seitz's predictions were critiqued by Johann Carion, an astrologer and advisor to the court of Prince Joachim I of Brandenburg, in his work Prognostication and Explanation of the Major Flooding. In it, Carion attacks Seitz, stating that he is out of his element and that he rummaged around in the Alphonsine tables or in the works of other men learned in this art instead of performing his own calculations. Despite this, Carion too strongly supports the coming of a flood, albeit in a somewhat limited manner. He predicts, "Never have waters risen higher than those that will come in 24. They will not cause damage in the lowlands or highlands, except to wash away some chattels. But one must be mindful that in places not entirely surrounded by hills, the water may flood in everywhere. Accordingly, towns on the coast and areas under the sign of Pisces and Virgo must be watchful, as the most fearful influence of these signs will obviously be upon them. Indeed, because of the floodwaters, the damaged lands will not be fertile the following years. Great famine and misery shall be upon the land for the poor. And this inundation of rising waters shall surround the earth in great mists, such that, after the summer phase of the sun, a pestilence, suddenly and deathly, shall stalk the land in autumn. Although Carion was an astrologer, this work reads much more as revealed prophecy than others. Carion goes so far as to cite other historical figures who were considered prophets, such as Methodius, Joachim of Fior, and Hildegard of Bingen. Carion's work was extremely popular and was reprinted several times. Interestingly, each time, his cover became more dramatic. The 1521 image was a trio of images, one with a peaceful depiction of sunshine, another a flood, and a third illustrates a peasant revolt in which a clergyman is being executed. In the 1522 edition, the flood becomes even more dramatic, and the 1524 edition depicts the flood amid an outbreak of violence. In this same vein of predicting a partial flood, we also find the Practicum Trium Annorum by Conrad Gallianus. This text is mostly a typical horoscope for the year, giving speculation on the price of fruits or where wars or disease might break out. However, an additional commentary is added to address the concerns of the impending flood. In it, Gallianus assures readers that a global flood is impossible because observation shows that wherever there are wars in one region, followed by pestilence or famine in another, peace, health, and fertility may reign, even if those regions are adjoining. Gallianus weighs the various arguments we have discussed and ultimately decides in favor of regional floods, largely to the north. Thus, he gives warning to those living in Asia, Spain, Germany, those living near the Rhine, the Danube, and those rivers which flow over a long distance to fortify themselves upon their shores. It should also be mentioned that Gallianus was a licentiate of sacred theology, which indicates that he had prepared for a leadership role in the church, again affirming that the faithful rarely took issue with astrology or astronomy in general. The same is true of Brother Michael de Petrasancta, who wrote a pamphlet in defense of judicial astrologers from the conjunction of the planets in Pisces in 1524. Despite its title, this text is more a discussion on the limits of astrology, citing numerous authorities on the topic. But with regard to the flood, Petrasancta does give some pushback against Nifo and notes that Mashallah claimed that a conjunction of Saturn and Mars signifies an abundance of rain. This contradicts Nifo's argument that Mars's nature would mitigate some of the disaster. Another astrologer to offer some pushback was Thomas Rocha, who wrote a worthy rebuttal of the 3 books of Augustinus Nifus which he addressed to Charles Caesar. As the title suggests, this was intended as a response to Nifo, in which Rocha rejects several of Nifo's claims. Specifically, he maintains that planets do hold a substantial influence and that Mars's contrary nature will not counteract or diminish the flood. He also rejects the notion that a drought must precede a flood. In 1522, the discussion didn't change significantly. Johann Elisius published his Most True Liberation from the Fearful Enough Flood. Contrary to Gallianus, who predicted that the flood would hit hardest in the north, Elisius predicts these things will appear in the lands lying between the south and the west, which is the land close to the Mediterranean, overlooking Africa and Europe, as well as the newly inhabited lands, starting from the bends of the Red Seas to the south through the Cape of Good Hope and coming westwards. This prediction is interesting because it is a rare acknowledgement of the southern hemisphere. Also this year, Thomas Montis published a Quod Libet, a topic for a philosophical or theological discussion on the 1524 flood. In it, we find Montis citing the usual ancient authorities, but he also begins citing more recent astronomers who wrote in Latin. This includes John of Seville from the 12th century, as well as Albertus Magnus from the 13th century, who Nifo had also cited, and Robert Perscrutator of York from the 14th century. Montis again believes that the flood will not be universal and gives reasons as to why the effects of the conjunction shall be diminished. But perhaps most interestingly, we find Montis castigating other authors claiming a universal flood as men who were moved by a great haste to tell the commoners something horrible they had heard. In this, Montis criticizes the overdramatization of the subject. This is an entirely logical position for Montis to have taken because, as an academic, he was fully aware of the various texts we've been discussing, which create contrary positions. Thus, Montis recognized that all arguments were simply arguments from authority, and various writers could pick and choose which ones suited them best. As such, when it came time for Montis to make his own prognostications, he still predicted wars, strife, great destruction, and death amongst princes and other nobles, and other horrendous changes, but left them measured and unspecific. Montis's works came under harsh attack from Damianus Ferrarius de Fenaco. He criticized Montis for questioning how the planets transmitted their influence. Montis had indicated that it was the light we received from the planets, whereas Ferrarius held that it was their position. Furthermore, he attacked Montis for the rather widespread claim that the conjunction could, in some way, be diminished. Ferrarius held that the effect must match the vehemence of the cause. Lastly, he took issue with the claim that the effects could be spread out over time. Again, this was not an argument limited to Montis, but it didn't stop Ferrarius from targeting Montis specifically, stating that Montis's work should be thrown into the fire rather than be put on the shelf. Historians have speculated that Ferrarius targeted Montis specifically due to a rivalry between their associated universities. Montis published a response to this attack, but it didn't really add anything particularly new to the discussion. A few additional publications come out this same year. One, from Ludovicius Vitalis, asks if the influence of planets is truly magnified by such conjunction. He concludes that it is, but agrees with the previous authors, that their contrary natures will counteract the influences. Dr. Johannes Kopp publishes a text which ultimately predicts a localized disaster. And Thomas Gianotti tosses his lot in with the widespread flood advocates, predicting a flood of unimaginable proportions. The year preceding the flood had another increase in publications. Near the beginning of the year, one of the heavyweights of the era weighs in, George Tannstetter. Tannstetter was well known, and he had worked with George von Purbach as an editor of his Tabulae Eclipsum, and served as the personal physician for Maximilian I and Ferdinand I. Tannstetter's position was largely that Nifo and Pighius had the right idea in arguing that conjunctions are overstated and that a return to Ptolemy was needed. However, he goes beyond them to provide a list of instances in which similar conjunctions occurred but no flood. In particular, in 670 CE, he points out that precisely the same planets were present in Pisces, and an even more ominous eclipse had occurred the prior year. Yet, there was no reported flood then. He also notes that astrologers incorrectly predicted a flooding from a conjunction in 1503 and 1504, yet the Danube was at record lows. But Tannstetter also criticizes the astrological community for even making such predictions. He notes that, despite being frequently asked to do so, he endeavored to abstain from casting nativities for kings and capital cities more so than others, so that cities and towns should not be frightened. Those who predict such cataclysmic floods, he says, do the greatest harm to the very ancient and almost divine art of astrology by deviating from its precepts and inventing vain dreams and idle stories. He calls the publications the delusions of a printer or barber, as a good man would not take it upon himself to write such prophecies as the ones that he had observed. Unfortunately, Tannstetter attributed the origin of the flood prognostications to Stoeffler. As we've seen, several authors have made this claim, but the intellectual weight Tannstetter carried finally prompted Stoeffler to respond. Stoeffler states that he never made such a prediction. He defends the doctrine of conjunctions and states that the conjunction of 670 was not sufficiently similar to the one of 1524 to be a valid comparison. He notes that not only did he predict 16 conjunctions in Pisces in February, but that there would be 3 additional conjunctions in Pisces in March. Thus, it was not only a significant set of conjunctions, but it occurred over a longer period of time. He also criticizes Tannstetter's report of the 670 conjunction. Tannstetter had proposed that Mercury would be in conjunction with Saturn on February 6th, followed by Jupiter on the 7th. However, in both cases, he stated that this would happen in the third degree of Pisces. Since Mercury is an extremely fast-moving planet, this would be impossible. Indeed, in the roughly 19 hours between the two conjunctions, Mercury had moved around 2.5 degrees. 1523 also sees what is perhaps the most thorough rejection of a flood from Cornelius Duplicius de Scepper. In his work, Scepper comments thoroughly on many of the texts we've previously discussed, even the ones which were more moderate in their predictions. He takes every prediction from them and proceeds to lay out as many counter-arguments as possible. Like Montis, Scepper raises the specter of the contradictions between the astrological authorities. But whereas Montis had carefully laid them out and refused to take sides, Scepper concludes that the contradictions are too severe to resolve. Scepper also states that we should trust experience over astrological authorities and refers to other conjunctions from 1513 and 1520 which were expected to be the cause of significant storms but failed to produce the expected results. This is not to say that Scepper rejected astrological practice. Rather, Scepper argues for the use of lunar mansions and alternative divisions of the zodiac which would place the conjunctions in a dry sign. Furthermore, the larger purpose of Scepper's treatise was to reconcile astrology with his Christian faith. Another notable entry from this year comes from Pedro Cirvelo. This work lays out the various positions and ultimately concludes that the months leading up to the conjunction will be rainy, but not ruinously so. Still, the general precautions should be made to set aside extra food, not plant in low-lying regions, and not to sail during this time. But he tells readers that they should not sell their possessions or leave their homes. But interestingly, in his cautionary stance, Cirvelo suggests that downplaying the predictions too much may lull the masses into a false sense of security. Thus, we see some pushback against Tannstetter and others who chided astrologers for alarming the public in the first place. Rounding out the year, we find a publication from Niccolo Peronzone in the same vein as Carion, but providing some predictions that are a bit more colorful. He says readers should expect earthquakes, imprisonments, search for treasure and alchemical quests, building of edifices, investigations of hidden things, and administration of inheritances. Abiosus of Bagnoli joins the moderate side, rejecting a universal flood as impossible and claiming that Noah's flood only occurred due to a divine miracle. Surprisingly, Abiosus does not reject the doctrine of conjunctions and indeed defends it, stating that astronomy has learned much since the time of Ptolemy. He predicts regional flooding, not only based on the stars, but also by animal signs. Lastly, we find the bishop, Paul of Middelburg, weighing in against either universal or regional flooding. Paul was a veteran astrologer of nearly 30 years. As the fated year began, Brother Sebastian Constantinus published a work on the topic. He argued that men at the time of Noah ignored divine warnings based on demonic suggestions, to their peril. It's unclear whether he truly believed that a flood was imminent, but he too argues that it is better to persuade people that there will be a flood rather than persuade them that they are free from danger. To the list of omens, Constantinus also adds a solar eclipse on February 4th. But although there was an eclipse on this date, he predicted it would be visible in Germany and Rome, when in fact it was truly only visible in the southern hemisphere, largely over the Atlantic Ocean, where it appeared as an annular eclipse, or was visible as a partial eclipse up to the northern latitudes of Africa. But although Constantinus was concerned about the signs, he admits that the danger that the stars foretell does not always come to pass. The last text that I found, which directly comments on the flood, was written by Silvester Lucare. The treatise isn't particularly noteworthy in and of itself, but is humorous because of the self-aggrandizing writing, in which Lucare suggests that he came to Rome to fill an important position, only to find that many of the nobles had already fled the city, claiming to be hunting. He says that he was accused in a friendly manner of being a daredevil for coming to a city with the flood so imminent. Lucare says that he then sought the source of the flood claims and states that he found they were being made by certain persons completely ignorant of the astral sciences, which led him to take it upon himself to deliver his friends from so much fear. I can't seem to find any information on who this individual was, but the publication's title page does have the Medici coat of arms, so perhaps his claim regarding an important position is true. If you have more information, let me know in the comments. Ultimately, the predictions of a global flood failed to materialize. Interestingly, we have some accounts of the weather from various authors. Foremost among them is a daily account of the weather in Bologna from Andrea Pietramarella for most of that year. For February, the weather there was reportedly fair, although he admits hearing rumors that outside Italy, and especially at Naples, in the mountains, long rains had occurred, and there had been earthquakes. Also rivers had submerged houses and villas, not without great calamity to mortals. In Bologna, in mid-March, there were heavy rains at night. In May, priests offered prayers for 3 days for fair weather. But heavy wind and thunderstorms came later that month, prompting the priests to ring the church bells in an effort to ward them away. This happened again on June 12th and July 14th. On July 20th, there was a heavy storm with hail the size of chickens' eggs, which persisted for a few days, and in August, there was some flooding, which killed livestock and forced people from their homes. In October and November, he reports more rain leading to streams overflowing. Finally, in December, he notes that the weather improved, which is where his record ends. An account from Kilian Leb in Rebdorf, Germany, notes that the weather for the month contained a great deal of rain and snow, but there were also not any earthquakes or floods, as predicted. One of the greatest curiosities of this discussion is the amount of misinformation that spread. We've seen this previously with the numerous accusations that Stoffler was the originator of the flood prognostication, despite his extremely vague and relatively mild forecast. But leaving this aside, we've seen that many of the authors responded to allegations of a universal flood. But even amongst the most dire of authors, none were truly so extreme. Yet panic is still said to have spread across the entire continent. Lorenz Fries provides a possible explanation, noting that soothsayers were able to terrify people into expecting a flood because people tend to read only the title page of a publication. As we have seen, many of the title pages were filled with dramatic images of destruction, so it seems in medieval times, people still didn't read past the headline. But despite the dramatic prognostications and the tales of panic, historian Steven Vandenbroek notes that what is lacking from this discussion is a single first-hand account of anyone who saw the thousands of printings and actually tells us that they were concerned or frightened at the prospect of an imminent flood. Lynn Thorndike notes that the conjunction of 1524 does not seem to have impressed the historians as it did astrologers. He notes that the medieval historian Marco Guazzo, who published a history for the year 1524 through 1549, did not even mention the conjunction or the subsequent panic. The Chronicles of Wilhelm Rehm do mention the flood panic and indicate that a number of apprentices used it as a Shrovetide carnival play, which typically occurs in February. This met with disapproval from the city council, which had the apprentices arrested for the production. Thus, in the end, the flood panic appears to have been as insignificant as the floods themselves.